Good morning. Today we look at John chapter 2. And chapter 2, it begins with on the third day. And so if you look back, remember back in chapter 1, verse 29 says the next day. So John had been baptizing and Pharisees had been questioning him. And then, here we have the next day, John saw Jesus coming. And then verse 43, the next day Jesus decided to go to Galilee. And then on the third day, in Cana of Galilee, so where Jesus had gone, he goes to a wedding. And while he's at the wedding, his mother talks to him. And you know this story. They ran out of wine. And Jesus, his mother says, the mother of Jesus said to him, they have no wine. Yeah, so what, Mom? What does that have to do to me? And he says, woman, what concern is that of mine? My hour has not yet come. So Jesus, even though he has been baptized and had the Spirit descend upon him, and John has identified him, Jesus said, my hour is not yet. It's not quite time yet. But, Mary, his mother, kind of takes matters into her own hands and tells the servants, just do what he tells you to do. And, kind of lays it at Jesus' feet that something needs to be done. And there's, a lot of talk that, this wedding was relative, family. And family, of course, you wouldn't want to have them be embarrassed by running out of wine. And a wedding wasn't just a one-day affair, but it was quite a several days. And the wine was they didn't drink it to get inebriated. They drank it because that was safer than a lot of the water. But anyway, Jesus told them to fill the jars. And without any further ado, tells the steward, draw some out, or tells the servant to draw some out, take it to the steward. And we have this good wine. And verse 10, Jesus did this, the first of his signs. I have that underlined. And we have the 7 signs of Jesus. I mentioned that as we began. In Galilee. So this is the first of the signs, and it says it revealed his glory, and his disciples believed in him. At this point in time, we've seen, kind of heard him call, the four disciples, Andrew and Peter and Philip and Nathaniel. How many more were with him? We don't know for sure. But then after the wedding feast and the celebration is over, several days that he's been there, it says he went down to Capernaum with his mother, his brothers, and his disciples, and remained there a few days. So, he went to Capernaum where, he made his home. And then we have the first Passover that Jesus celebrates in Jerusalem during his 3 years of ministry. And in John's gospel, it tells us that he found people selling cattle, sheep, doves, money changers seated at their tables. And so Jesus does the cleansing of the temple here at the very beginning of his ministry. The other 3 gospels have the cleansing of the temple during that last week of the week that he is there before his crucifixion. And does it matter? Not really. But what matters is that we know that Jesus had a passion for the house of God, for the synagogue. And Jesus had been brought up, going to the synagogue. We saw that in Luke, that when he was 12, his parents took him to Jerusalem for the Passover, as was their custom. And so it was customary for Jesus to go to Jerusalem for the Passover. And he did it here, and he, it says he drove them all out of the temple. He poured out the coins of the money changers, overturned their tables. He was filled with a righteous anger. He says, this is my Father's house. Stop making my Father's house a marketplace. So here, Jesus is claiming sonship of God. I mean, my Father's house. He calls the synagogue my Father's house. And I don't think that was very common for most people to call the church their Father's house. But he did. He called the synagogue his Father's house. And then here John John's gospel, he says, the Jews then said to him, so the Jews generally are, as I said, the Pharisees, the scribes, the religious leaders. And they say, what sign can you do for doing this? And I think it's just, a play on words for John, is that the first sign of Jesus was turning the water into wine. And now the people ask, what sign can you give for doing this? Why did you tip these tables over? Why did you cleanse the temple of, why did you tell these people that are selling the sacrifices and, doing business here? Why did you do this? What sign can you give us? Where did you get the authority? And, Jesus' answer really doesn't make sense to them, because he says, destroy this temple and in 3 days I will raise it up. And of course they think that it's the temple that he's talking about, the synagogue. But Jesus is talking about his body after the resurrection, after his death. And John tells us that, the disciples remembered that he said this after his resurrection. Verse 22, after he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered this. And, it's one of those things that, we have things that happen to us, and we may not think about them on a daily basis or remember them always, but all of a sudden something pops into our mind, a memory. We do something, or we see something, or someone says something, and we remember. And it's important that we have those memories. And the disciples remembered that Jesus had proclaimed that his Father's house was a place of worship, not a place to buy and sell, not a place to take advantage of others, because that's what some of these people were doing. Not all of them, I'm sure there were some honest ones, but there were, probably a little bit some shady dealings going on there, evidently too. But, Jesus was upset by that. And verse 23, when he was in Jerusalem during the Passover, many believed on his name because they saw the signs he was doing. And so here we have this first Passover, and we've had just one sign, that John tells us about, the wedding, turning the water into wine at the wedding of Cana. And then, his cleansing the temple, but was that really a sign? He didn't do anything miraculous. That's the signs that John shows us, tells us about, are miracles, things that, normally couldn't happen. Most people, people couldn't do. But when John tells us many believed in his name because they saw the signs he was doing, tells us that Jesus was doing more, than we are told. I mean, maybe he gave sight to a blind man, restored somebody's hearing. We don't know for sure exactly what signs John is talking about here. And even though, John just records and tells us of 7 signs, the very last thing that he tells us, John tells us in his gospel, chapter 21, verse 25, there are also many other things that Jesus did. If everyone was written down, the world itself could not contain the books that would be written. And before that, in the end of chapter 20, verse 30, John says, now Jesus did many other signs in the presence of his disciples, which are not written in his book. But these are written so that you may come to believe that Jesus is the Messiah and the Son of God, and that through believing you will have life in his name. So even though we don't have all of the signs, and even though the Gospels, all the 4 Gospels, some of them have, there's a couple things that are in all 4 Gospels. Some are in 3 or 2, some are just in 1 Gospel. But you tie them all together, and it is there. This Gospel, this this intro to the New Testament, this introduction to Jesus' life, so that we may come to know and believe in Jesus and to have life in his name. And so we can look and we can ask for more, and there's jokes and different things all the time, of give me a sign, and what we have in the Bible to tell us about Jesus is sufficient so that we can know and trust.